I think you need that sort of drive, that whether it's anxiety or adrenaline or whatever, or excitement, you need that to, I think, to drive that force of the creativity.
I'm really, really curious to hear more about how you work and why you work. So can you tell us in the beginning a little bit of what type of art you make? What are the forms of art that you're working in?
So I work in many different forms of art. I think people often ask me which I prefer. And I think it's whichever I happen to be working in at any particular moment. So I love painting, mostly with acrylics, sometimes mixed media, occasionally watercolors, colored pencil. I love working with. And at the other end of the scale, I really, really enjoy working with paper cutting. So I cut out of paper using a surgical scalpel. So that's two opposite ends of the scale. Somewhere in the middle, I do sculpting, which is often very intricate and very detailed, with a lot of movement and usually mixed media. So yeah, there's lots of different styles in which I work. I'm also increasingly doing film, so I do a bit of animation occasionally. And apart from that, I paint giant animal statues for public art trails around the UK, which are great fun to do. For anyone listening in, if you're not sure what I mean, you may have seen those giant animal statues around city centres and so on, all painted by different artists. That's what I'm talking about. And I do a lot of those, paint them with different designs, often with silhouettes, which is something I've sort of adapted from my paper cutting technique. So it sort of makes sense, all of those sort of things together.
Amazing. I really love that you do so many different things, and I can really understand that and relate to that, because I'm kind of similar. Do you have, I'm not going to ask you which one you prefer, because as you answered already, but why do you think that is? Why do you think you feel yourself drawn to different art forms and to kind of move from one to the other and back and forth?
I think I just love challenges. So if something new comes up, and I should say I very often work to a brief. So I do a lot of commissioned work, bespoke commissioned work. So in that case, somebody will come to me with an idea that they've got, and quite often my first reaction will be, oh my goodness, how on earth? That sounds impossible. And then I'll sort of stop and think about it, and actually a few minutes later I've sort of begun to think about how I'll do it. And I think that's really where it's come from. I don't like to get bored. I suppose I would, if I did the same sort of style, the same sort of medium all day long every day, I would get very bored of it. So I love variety. I think when I was studying at school, I wasn't just into art. I was into, sciences and literature and history and everything. And I wanted to, ideally I would have taken them all further. And languages as well. I mean, I suppose very multifaceted in that way. And I think that's reflected in my artwork too, that I'll try my hand at anything, and quite often that will feed back into what I do more generally.
So do you think that's there's a lot of curiosity maybe that drives you as an artist, and
yes,
and
definitely.
maybe because doing commission work, it requires of you to be, you know, ready to get into any sort of thing that people throw at you and might surprise you with.
Yeah, I know a lot of artists who sort of run a mile from commissions because they don't like the idea that their freedom is sort of curtailed by a commission, and I can understand that totally. Equally, the idea that if you do a piece for it as a commission, the client might reject it, sort of thing. But to be honest, I really love that challenge, the idea that you've actually got a brief and you need to match that vision. Quite often along that path, I will sort of drop little hints into the path, and the client will sort of think, oh, actually I really like that idea. And it's that sort of creative playing around that creates something which is the end result, which can be really exciting, actually.
I totally agree. And and I think if you look at history, how much of all the great artworks have been commissioned and wouldn't be there. Yeah, and it provides a living for artists, and I think that's really important, because otherwise you would probably be stuck in some other sort of work and wouldn't have the time and the means to explore. And it's just great to spend your day creating, I guess.
Oh dear. I get some very random commissions as well, which are great fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm gonna ask about that a bit more later. So if you compare working on something, you know, that comes out of your own inspiration and isn't you know, supposed to go anywhere, it's just, you know, you feel like you want to create something and you go do that, and then compared to that you have a sort of commission coming up, you have a deadline. Do you approach those very differently, or do you approach those the same way?
Quite differently, I would say, but there is a lot of common ground as well. I think with a piece that I've sort of just want to do for my own creative expression, I often will have an idea, a seed of an idea, and I'll sort of plant it and let it grow and nurture it, and then I often dance my work into being. I love dance. It's one of my greatest passions. So that is something that flows into it. Music, quite often going out for a walk or anything that allows me to have fresh influx of ideas and inspiration. Or it might be a conversation with somebody. Anything like that will sort of be a source of things that I'll absorb into myself and just allow them to gestate, I think is the word. And then that becomes like a sort of a birthing process, if you like. So I think that can be quite a long-term process. Although, having said that, the end result, the painting or whatever I do, the sculpture, often doesn't take me very long at all. It might take me an hour or a day at the most, sort of thing. And so for anyone sort of an external observer, they would think, gosh, you've done that in like an hour. The reality is that it started, you know, years, months ago, whatever. So I always think of the creative process as a journey. And it can start out as a sort of a sort of meandering through the country lanes, if you like, without a clear destination in mind, just sort of thinking, well, I'm just going for a walk. I'm not going anywhere particularly. I'm just going to enjoy the birdsong and the wildlife. And within that process of actually going for the walk, you absorb those, you know, you have those enriching experiences which feed into your creativity and allow you to create something beautiful at the end. So yeah, the creative, I do think of it as a journey, very much so.
Great.
Yeah,
I find that really interesting. And I find it particularly interesting that you mentioned in the beginning that dance is inspiring you a lot, because when I looked at your work, the one thing that really stood out to me was that there is always a motion, a movement, that it feels very alive and not
yeah,
static at all. And I think
yeah.
that really translates from your process into your work.
Thank you. I'm glad that comes across. Movement is absolutely key, I think. Not just to, well, I think movement works on every level. So you've got the idea of the, the bloodstream, for example, the circulation. Without that, we'd die. You've got movement, for example, in the economy. If the economy sort of becomes stagnant, you've got something that doesn't work. On a spiritual level, I find, you have to have that movement, otherwise you sort of become rigid and fossilized. In art, it's exactly the same sort of idea. And I have to move. If I'm, when I'm painting, I stand up, I'm moving backwards and forwards, constantly stepping back to look at my work, often listening to music, often dancing while I'm painting. So all of that flows into it. It's this energy that flows in. And I call myself a speed painter for that reason as well, because I work very quickly, work from my shoulder. So it's that sort of enormous sweeping motion that you get with the brush or whatever. Of course, that doesn't work as quite in the same way with a surgical scalpel. If you did that with a surgical scalpel, you'd be slightly lethal. But in a sense, it's the same, because even the paper cuts I do, although they are fiendishly intricate and detailed, they start with a very loose sketch, which can be, a few minutes, half an hour of just sort of loosely sketching and scribbling on the paper with a colored pencil. And then that will form the basis of something that's really, really detailed and might take days to cut out.
Yeah, very interesting, that whole process. And I love that you are feeling the motion so much when you're doing your art. Do you find yourself because I'm often going in and out of phases. So I have phases where I create a lot, and then I have phases where I go more silent and I become more like a sponge and absorb things. Do you find that you need your creativity to keep flowing? And that's maybe one of the reasons why you do a lot of commission, because it keeps you in that motion? Or do you find that when you have a longer break that is actually inspiring as well?
Both, I think, are true. I think most of the time I try and keep up that momentum, and I do. I suppose any time I sort of feel myself slowing down, I panic. I'm very anxious. I get very frustrated, and I have to sort of almost I've put a lot of effort in to get past that sort of block, if you like, that damming up of the river, and then I can let it flow again, and then I feel fine, and I'll dance and paint and so on. Having said all that, when I was at university, I didn't study art at university. I did Arabic, and so for 4 years, just over 4 years at Edinburgh, I didn't do any art at all. And in that time, I was doing, like I was saying earlier, I was sort of doing mostly languages, obviously, and history, philosophy, all the sort of things, the literature that reflect on art from different angles, if you like. I ended up doing my dissertation about Arabic calligraphy, so I was, I suppose, beginning to get back into it. But the fact was that throughout that period, I was using the Arabic script, which is so beautifully artistic and fluent and flowing and so on. So I think in that sense, I was developing that sense of movement all that time, allowing it to keep flowing. After those 4 years, I resumed art full time, and everybody said to me, wow, Lois, you've come on so far in those 4 years. And I hadn't done any art for 4 years. So that was quite eye-opening for me. And I remember that very distinctly, that yes, it can be a good idea to just have a complete break, do something completely different. And I think what happens is the brain sort of tends to assimilate the things that it's absorbed over those years, and it sort of makes sense of them more, and it obviously absorbs other influences. Because I spent most of my time in the library back then, and I discovered all sorts of interesting things which I wouldn't have otherwise. Met interesting people, and all of that combined sort of then enriched my creativity again. So it is fascinating to me how that works. The idea that you can take this break from art and come back refreshed and renewed. It's like leaving the field fallow for a year, and then it's more fertile when you return to it.
Yeah, I think when we make art, I think we're in a very active process, and so it's nice to step back from that and just allow yourself to absorb. And it's a cyclic thing for me, definitely. I just think everyone has probably different length of cycles, and sometimes it can both happen at the same time, that you take something in and it comes right back out.
Yeah, exactly.
When you work with speed creation, so I've had a look at that a little bit, and so you have an audience sometimes when you do this, right?
I should say before lockdown, I used to always have an audience. Right now, of course, I'm unable to work live in public.
Yeah.
So I've had to adapt, and mostly I'm doing it via my YouTube channel, which is still sort of, you still have an audience, but you can't actually see them.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, carry on.
So when you do that, when you have an audience, how are they part of that process? Do you feel it's more a sort of performance? Do you feel they're active participants and influence you in how you do things and what you do? If they react, do you?
Yeah, all of those, totally. It's very much a performance art when you're standing painting live in public, and people, complete strangers walk up and you engage them in conversation while you're actually painting. Because of course the cliche is, and you hear them whisper, oh, it's an artist, shh, don't disturb her. And I say to them, come on over, come and have a look close up. And they can then see what I'm doing, and I'll tell them what I'm doing, and I'll explain why I'm using a palette knife as opposed to a brush, and all this sort of thing. And they often then tell me their life story or their anecdotes about how they studied art at school and were completely put off by it by their teacher and so on. Or they'll tell me that they've picked it up in later life and really love painting and so on. So yes, all of that flows into the creative process in the end. And I very much encourage that engagement and interaction. And it is very much like when you're, if you're a performer on stage, you're feeding off that buzz of excitement from the crowd. That to me is a huge part of painting live. That all started years ago when I used to go down to London for roots reggae and dub nights years ago, and I used to spend all night dancing and painting live. And yeah, it was very much, I became part of, I became one of the performers essentially. I was sometimes on a bit of a podium or on stage or something alongside the DJs or the musicians. And that was great fun. But that's how I sort of got into painting live in public. And up until the lockdown, I've done just that in galleries, in shopping centres, in all sorts of random places. And yeah, really enjoyed it, especially I think when young children come up, and often they sort of step, they come up behind you, and you have to be careful not to sort of step back and tread on them because they're that close. But that feeling actually of being able to hush children, they'll be sort of tearing around the museum or whatever it is, and their parents will be trying to tell them to be quiet, and then they'll come up and they'll see me painting and they'll suddenly go quiet. The magic moment.
It sounds like there's a bit of an educational element to this as well, like not that you're going out for that, but people would probably be interested in how is she doing this, how does this come to life.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I've for many years I've also taught art in this. Well, I hesitate to use the word teaching because I don't really think of myself as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I think of myself more as a guide and an encourager and someone who brings out of people what they can already do. Mm-hmm. Because you're not actually teaching them anything that they can't do in themselves. You're just sort of bringing it, coaxing it out. And so for years I've done, I've led workshops and so on. So yes, there is that educational element, certainly. I think it's just I love sharing my work, and the last thing I want to be is an artist who works sort of closeted away in their own four walls at home and never interacts with people. I think it was Vincent van Gogh said something like the greatest art is to love people, which I've always thought, yes, that makes perfect sense. If you can't absorb and interact with people through your art, then it's meaningless in a way, to me anyway. And when you see, that's the other thing, when you actually see the reactions, the response, the feedback, you don't get that in working at home on your own, sort of thing. But when you're working live in public or teaching, you get that instant live feedback, and that is incredibly enriching in itself and encouraging. And or occasionally you get people who sort of question what you're doing and challenge it, or say, oh, I could do better than that. And so you sort of you're suddenly, you're put into that position where you question, and it's a really healthy thing to do. Why am I doing this? Often I have to then sort of explain, well, I'm doing this because, whatever. And it's I just think it's a very healthy thing to have that interaction, especially when it's completely live.
So do you feel like the last year, obviously not having that to that extent, did that feel very different? And do you think it kind of pushed you in a direction that you usually might have not gone? And are there like positive things coming out of that?
There's been a lot of positive things for me in the last year. Not least of all the fact that I haven't had to travel everywhere almost every day. I was sort of getting, to be honest, quite tired of traveling on trains every day. But yeah, I think being in lockdown has meant that I've just sort of shifted the emphasis of my work over, partly, as I mentioned, towards my YouTube channel. So I'm still doing all those demos and things, but more to a camera, which I suppose it's just given me a whole new sort of angle on it. Literally in some cases, because you can obviously put the camera at different angles, and it's just very interesting to put the camera above or below or from one side or a long way off. That sort of process of getting to grips with filmmaking for me has been quite a revelation in itself. It gives you a whole new perspective on art, on creation. Equally, I think in that time I've I suppose come to focus more and more on the commissions, because I had to obviously earn a living that way, and really enjoyed doing those. Yeah, I think lockdown has been, I think, for many artists, but I think for introverts, and I would say, even though I've been working out in the public, I am naturally very introverted, very sort of shy. I am very shy. So coming back into this sort of locked away sort of feel has been quite healing for me as well. That chance to just sort of ground myself a bit and not have to appear in public every day. I think I've really enjoyed that sort of change. I wouldn't say that I will never go back to doing the live art. I hope that I will in time when it's safe and so on. I don't think it would quite work wearing a mask and so on at the moment, but in time we'll see. It's something, you know, I do find, I mean, potentially with my YouTube channel, though, that I have a worldwide audience rather than just, you know, a group of a dozen people here. So there are pros and cons, definitely.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because the last year definitely gave us time to look at things and focus on things that maybe there wasn't the time for. And I think as an artist, it forces you to do what is possible, and that might not be what you gotten into doing. I think especially after a few years working as a professional artist, it's very easy to focus on the things that people want from you, rather than what you actually want to explore. Do you find you have any, like, what would you say at the moment are the things that interest you the most, like things that are besides commissions that you are interested in exploring?
Well, one of the first things that happened early on in the lockdown was that I began to focus more on using materials, art materials that anyone can access. And that was in that sense of, you know, if I'm going to carry on doing, you know, tuition or whatever on, you know, through tutorials on my YouTube channel, how can I reach out to people who don't have art materials at home? Because when I used to go and teach in a gallery or somewhere, obviously they'd have all of the art materials there. But people at home don't have access to all these things. They don't have a vast array of palette knives, for example. So suddenly I was thrown into that feeling of, what can I paint with? What can I use at home that everybody will have? And for me, that was one of the best things that could happen, because it set me off on a creative journey afresh. I started about a year ago painting with tea and coffee and household items, things like obviously toothbrushes, mostly recycled plastic items, which of course are hugely relevant, you know, to this whole idea of, you know, we live in this throwaway society where everything is instant or disposable or whatever. And so to be able to repurpose and upcycle things in a creative way is a hugely creative thing in its own right. So it was really meaningful for me to be able to do that. And I really ended up loving the result. I've had commissions for coffee painting, for example. It's taken on a life of its own. I ended up doing a little animation for the National Trust using tea and coffee, and the lady said, "Oh, that is so National Trust," using tea bags. It was quite fun doing that, but it's just been a wonderful exploration doing that. I love working with coffee, particularly because it has this wonderful sort of rich pigment. Basically, I'm using instant coffee granules with just a few drops of water mashed up into a paste. So you've got something that's sort of a little bit like watercolor, but just a little bit thicker. And depending on how it dries, it can be sort of partially three-dimensional, just very slightly textured and so fascinating. But then I ended up using things like plastic forks to scratch into it, and combs to stroke it into lines and so on. Fascinating sort of things you can do. Obviously, things like credit cards, to basically making my own palette knives out of household items.
Right.
What else did I use? Yeah, those were the main ones. The fork is actually, just a plastic fork from Starbucks or somewhere. Really fascinating, sort of, because it has that little bit of flexibility in it, just like a palette knife, and you can get the most incredible marks with it. Oh, and of course, blowing through a plastic straw.
Yeah.
So you get the pigment and it sort of spreads out in this magic way like a tree. Yeah. I mean, all these things I would never have discovered, I don't think, if I hadn't been suddenly dropped into that thing of, you need to be able to reach out to people who don't have anything at home. What are you going to do? It's like, oh.
Sounds very exciting and very fun. I think
it is
great to set yourself challenges like this, and also I find restrictions hugely inspiring when you say, okay, what is around here that I can use? That's really great.
It's very much in the spirit of our times anyway, regardless of lockdown. I think it's very relevant.
Great. Do you have anything particular that you're looking forward to creating in the near future? Do you like a new challenge or something that is coming up, or that you would really like to try and haven't tried yet?
I think one thing I'm very keen to explore more of, and at the same time very daunted by, is animation, stop motion, things like that. I do actually have an animation project that is sort of slowly coming to light, but it's one of those things that absolutely terrifies me, because it's so labor intensive. And I've done tiny bits of stop motion in my life before, and it's, you sort of almost give up the will to live, because it's so tedious, but the results can be extraordinary and dramatic. So that's one thing I'd love to do more of, and I am doing more of slowly. Gosh, there's so many things. I've got sort of book illustration projects that are slowly ongoing and hopefully will unfold. I'd like, if there's never enough hours in the day, but ultimately I want to do my own books as well, and do, I think, sort of picture books for adults is sort of what I have in mind. But I don't know, there's so many ideas that I have.
Yeah, it's unlimited possibilities, really.
Yeah,
absolutely. Some things.
Yeah, I should say that I work part-time also now with, again, since lockdown, I've been working part-time as a program leader and lead artist for our local Arts for Mental Health and Wellbeing charity, Inside Out Community. And as part of that, I think I've had so much sort of inspiration and ideas, and of course that focus on mental health and well-being, which is so relevant today to everybody, post lockdown, well, still lockdown. That whole emphasis is something that I want to, I suppose, dwell on more and more, because it is so important to everyone.
Do you find that creating is something that is like almost like a cathartic process sometimes for yourself and for others? How often do you find yourself being driven by a mental state or an emotion that's maybe not, on the positive side of things?
Most of the time, I would say. I suppose most of my adult life I've had terrible anxiety. I mean, most people, when I tell them that, they say, but you're so calm and so peaceful and so on. Of course, we tend to hide these things in, don't we? But I am a very highly strung, nervous type, and so but the moment I pick up the paintbrush and start painting, I'm calm. It's incredible, that change. People, the same thing when people used to see me painting in public and they say, how do you have the courage to do this? And I say, well, you know, I probably lose a week's sleep beforehand, but the moment I start painting, I'm totally in it and I'm totally relaxed and I just do it. I think that's the performance thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think you need that sort of drive, that, whether it's anxiety or adrenaline or whatever, or excitement, call it excitement rather than anxiety, because it is both. You need that to, I think, to drive that force of the creativity.
Yeah.
Perhaps to begin with, sometimes. I think if I ever get into a state where I'm too, you know, really relaxed, I don't tend to create in that state. I tend to just relax and just chill out. It's very rare for me, but no, I think I thrive on that sort of, that driving force. Certainly, it's sort of, yeah, it just sort of, it's like coaxing a horse. You know, you have to trigger it to run. So
yeah,
yeah, it's a weird sort of balance that you have to get somewhere.
Yeah, I think when we then start creating, it really channels the energy into something productive. And I find that it's really the thing that will almost always kind of disperse anything that might have lingered. And it's the opposite as well. Like when I don't have time to create for a few days, I can feel the pressure kind of building. And the moment you let go, and in my case, it's often singing is the first thing I'll do.
Right. Yeah.
It's very liberating.
Yeah, exactly. So
dancing, well, dancing is really great way to kind of get that energy.
Yeah, dancing is a huge part of my life. I actually learned to love dancing when I was at university in my first year at Edinburgh, and the heating in our accommodation did not work, and so we had these awful night storage heaters which were ancient, and they just didn't work. So I was cold all the time. And then I found that putting on music and dancing not only warmed me up and got my circulation going again, but I actually suddenly realized I really enjoyed it, and it was something that became more and more of a passion and a sort of a quasi-spiritual experience. Often if you keep going, you throw yourself into that dance to the extent that that I suppose, you know, all the endorphins start flowing, and it is you become like this channel. You just mentioned the channel. It is very much like that when your ego steps aside and you're just channeling pure creativity, and that's when you let go of all the inhibitions and you just create. And to reach that point, it's quite an effort, but once you get there, it's hugely rewarding. So
it's interesting that came out of the necessity to keep warm.
Yeah.
That kind of leads into one of my last questions. So when you look back at your life, what were like moments or events that really shaped you as an artist, or that kind of changed the path for you and led you in a different direction?
So I think, I'm not sure you'd call it an event, but I had a very sheltered upbringing. To the extent that, you know, when I was at school, I was constantly teased for not having a clue about popular culture or anything. So I had this very, very limited childhood, very culturally, you know, enriched by my parents, but very, very limited and sort of claustrophobic. And then I sort of escaped from that. It was sort of like a feeling of liberation. And then being once again thwarted for several years by very, very negative relationships, in which I was basically told, you're not cut out for this, you're you can't, you know, you'll never survive as an artist, go and get a proper job, you know, all the sort of cliches. Time after time after time, you end up almost repeating that to yourself if you're told that often enough.
Yeah.
And then finally sort of escaping from that, and again that feeling of liberation. So it's sort of those have been pivotal moments for me. Obviously, those moments of just escaping and finding that, gosh, I can actually spread my wings and fly again. And the other thing apart from that was studying Arabic at university, which a lot of people sort of say, why? What on earth drove you to do that? And I think it was pure curiosity more than anything else. And the beautiful flowing script that I mentioned earlier that seduced me into studying Arabic. It's such an extraordinary language. It's sort of a window on another world for me because I had no background in it at all. And so that actually still influences my work. I notice every mark I make to this day, whether I'm drawing or painting or writing or anything. I notice still how studying Arabic script has influenced the way that I work with a pen or anything. So that still resonates with me, even though I don't really use the Arabic a lot now. Yeah. And lastly, and most importantly, meeting my partner, Jason, who is the exact opposite of those very negative relationships I had. And he's so supportive. And he said from the outset, he would rather sort of step away and let me fly on my own than thwart me in any way. And he's been amazing and so supportive. And I owe him a great deal. So that's been obviously a huge boost to my art as well.
That's beautiful.
Features a lot in my art as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
It's an inspiration. Yeah, I can see it. I think there are so many lessons to take from this. I think one definitely is you need to have the right environment, and if you have a toxic environment, you have to get out of that and allow yourself to discover and you know surround yourself by people who understand you and support you.
Although the flip side of that, I would say, is that having been in those situations where I was very claustrophobic and very intense and told I couldn't do this and couldn't do that, when you escape from that, you really appreciate the freedom in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. And I think that's really what I was trying to say, that I so appreciate that freedom now that I didn't have. So yeah, it's sort of it's a bit like just coming out of an ivory tower and finding that you've got the world out there, and it's so exciting.
I think that the more challenging times really inform are the most, and it's I also would say that it's probably not good to be in an environment that is too comfortable all the time, because otherwise you probably don't get the push to try different things, or to, as you said before, like working with audiences gives you, it's like an uncomfortable environment. It's not like you're at home, no one looks at you, you have all the time in the world. No, it's the opposite. So that can be, I guess, quite inspiring. And the other thing I'll take away from that is that it's sometimes maybe great to just follow your curiosity and just explore something, even if it doesn't necessarily serve a purpose like right away.
Very true. Very true.
I think I should do that more, because I find I became over the years more purpose oriented. Like everything I do has to have, it has to lead to something. And and sometimes it's maybe good if something is just there to be explored and to be enjoyed. It doesn't necessarily lead to anything, even though it might still do, but not trying to.
It's so true. So true. Very much like Alice through the, Alice in Wonderland, sort of, what's down here, down this rabbit hole? Oh, there's a whole new world. It's that logic of, just exploring and yeah, like you say, curiosity. I think it's absolutely key to creativity. Play and curiosity, I think, go hand in hand, because I often think as an artist that I don't think in a straight line. I think in curls, in spirals, I'll match things together which people don't normally match together. You know what I mean? And I think that's part of just sort of playing around and sort of randomly juxtaposing things. And that's when things get really exciting, when you suddenly sort of make a connection where there was none, and you think, actually, these make sense together,
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Two last questions. Question one, yeah. If you could give any upcoming artist, someone who's starting out and is, exploring what they want to do, if you could give them one piece of advice, what would that be?
One piece of advice, yeah. Surround yourself with people who are going to support you and be supportive, and just network with them, keep in touch with them. That sort of idea of I suppose consolidate your links with other creative people.
Great, that's very, very good advice. Yeah. And do you have any artists at the moment, whether within your field or in any of the others, that inspires you the most?
I think that would be the artist and children's book illustrator with whom I worked part-time for many years. Right from the time I was doing my GCSE and A-level artist reference studies at school, right up until only about 2 years ago, when sadly he's now got Alzheimer's and he's no longer working. But his name is Jan Piankowski, and he was the he co-authored the Meg and Mob books back in the 1960s, for example, and he did various pop-up books and so on. I've worked with him in his studio for years in between those times, and I think he's influenced me on so many levels, but not just as an artist, but purely his philosophy towards art, his philosophy towards mistakes, being that there are none. You accept them as little gifts in disguise, and they're actually blessings rather than curses. All this sort of idea. I think also his whole sort of range of artistic output was vast, and even though he's no longer doing it, sadly, but he, I think, will always be my favorite artist in that sense, on every level, because he's taught me not just about art per se, but the art of living in so many ways. He's quite a sort of a guru to me on many levels.
That's beautiful. I'm pretty sure people watching will recognize the name and recognize the work. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting and really inspiring. I hope it'll inspire lots of people to watch some of your videos, which I've done, and I really can only recommend, if you want to be more creative, whether you are an artist or just interested in art, that's a great starting point. Thank you so much for doing this interview with me.
Magdalene, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm really, really honoured that you've had me on. Really, really enjoyed talking to you.